Dawson slammed the cabin door shut, heart pounding as the girl writhed in his arms, whispering words he couldn't understand. Blood soaked through his shirt, hot and slick. Outside, the hoofbeats came again, closer this time, steady as a war drum. He reached for the Winchester, then froze when the horizon moved. 2 days earlier, the prairie had been quiet as a grave. Dawson Kincaid thought his days of trouble were long behind him, until he found her by the fence, bleeding into the dust. Dawson Kincaid spotted her near the north fence, barely standing. A slip of a thing, no older than 13, clothes torn, one arm clutched tight against her ribs. Blood seeped through her fingers, dark against sunburned skin. He swung down from his horse without thinking. 8 years alone had taught him to mind his own business. But something in her eyes stopped him cold. Wide, black as storm clouds, and filled with the kind of fear a man didn't forget. "Easy now," he said, voice low. She swayed, tried to speak in a language he didn't know. The words broke apart like dry leaves in the wind. Then her knees buckled. Dawson caught her before she hit the dirt. She was light as a sack of feathers. Too light. Fever burned through her skin, and up close he saw the wound. An ugly slash down her side, crusted with dust and sweat. Whoever did this meant for her to die slow. She tried to pull away, weak hands clawing at his shirt, whispering something sharp, desperate. He didn't need a translator to know she didn't trust him, couldn't blame her. Men like him had given her people every reason to hate white faces. But leaving her here wasn't an option. Coyotes would finish what the blades started. He lifted her into the saddle, her head lolling against his chest, breath shallow as a dying ember. "Hold on, kid," he muttered, swinging up behind her. "You didn't crawl this far just to die." As he rode toward his cabin, one thought cut through the dust and sweat. If she's Comanche, and if they find her here, God help me. Dawson shouldered the cabin door open with a grunt, the girl limp in his arms. He laid her gently on the bed. First time anyone but him had touched those sheets in 8 years. She stirred, a faint moan escaping her cracked lips. Fever sweat beaded her brow. He lit the lamp, its glow spilling across her torn dress. That's when he saw it. A necklace of fine beadwork hanging against her collarbone. Red and white patterns, intricate as spider silk. Not something worn by just anyone. This belonged to someone important. Dawson's stomach turned to stone. "Lord above," he whispered, brushing dirt from the beads. He'd seen that design once before. In town, when old Pete Morrison warned him over a whiskey. Those beads mark bloodline. White Bear's family. Touch one hair on his kin, and he'll bring hell to your door. White Bear. Comanche war chief. A name that could hush a saloon in mid-laughter. Dawson looked back at the girl. She was shaking now, caught in some fever dream, whispering words he couldn't understand. He fetched water, cleaned the wound as best he could, his hands steady though his mind wasn't. Every second ticked like a hammer strike. He thought about riding into town, handing her over, letting someone else carry this weight. But the nearest law was a half-day's ride, and the law out here wasn't built for mercy. They'd let her bleed or worse. When he spooned broth to her lips, she opened her eyes, dark pools, wet with pain, and for the first time, trust flickered there. Just a spark, but enough to burn through every excuse he had. Dawson sat back, heart pounding. He'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Outside, a coyote yipped in the distance. The sound carried like a warning. Dawson poured the last of his whiskey into a tin cup, hoping the burn would quiet the storm in his head. It didn't. The girl lay asleep under his blanket, her breath shallow but steadier now. Every so often she twitched like a rabbit in a snare, whispering in that soft, broken tongue. He pulled the curtain back and scanned the prairie. Empty. Always empty. That's why he'd chosen this patch of nowhere. No people, no problems. But today? Today he'd brought trouble home and laid it in his bed. His eyes drifted to the necklace again, glinting in the lamplight. White Bear's blood. Of all the Comanche in Texas, why her? Why here? He thought about riding her to town, come daylight, leaving her with the sheriff. Safer for him, maybe even for her. But then he pictured what would happen. A scared girl, feverish and alone, at the mercy of men who still used words like savage over coffee. They'd lock her up, or worse. Dawson's jaw tightened. He couldn't do it. He'd already made his choice the moment he lifted her from the dirt. A flicker outside the window caught his eye. Not lightning, not lantern glow. He stepped onto the porch, squinting against the last bleeding edge of daylight. Smoke, thin, rising from the distant hills. One column, then another, and another after that, spreading across the horizon like black fingers scratching at the sky. Dawson's mouth went dry. He'd seen that signal before during his army days. It wasn't a campfire. It wasn't settlers burning brush. It was Comanche, calling their own. He turned back to the cabin, where the girl slept under his roof, wearing the beads of a war chief's bloodline. Dawson set his cup down and checked the load on his Winchester. Whatever was coming, it wouldn't be friendly. The sun was bleeding out across the plains when Dawson heard hooves pounding up the trail. He stepped off the porch, Winchester in hand, every muscle tight as a drawn bow. 3 riders came fast, dust in their wake, faces grim. Orville Cutter led the pack, his red beard flashing like fire in the dying light. Behind him, Deputy Zeke Collins and Reverend Price, the closest thing to law and God within 50 miles. They pulled up hard, horses blowing steam in the cool dusk. Orville didn't bother with hello. "Kincaid," he barked, "tell me you ain't done what folks are saying." Dawson's gut clenched. "And what's that?" "That you got a Comanche girl holed up in that cabin." The preacher's eyes were wide, white as bone. "Son, if that's true, you've signed your own death paper." Dawson said nothing, and that silence was all the answer they needed. The deputy cursed under his breath and spat in the dust. "Smoke signals been popping all over the hills," Zeke said, voice low and tight. "They're looking for someone, and word in town says it's White Bear's blood." Dawson kept his face stone, but his heart was hammering like a smithy's anvil. "You know what that means?" Orville jabbed a finger toward the horizon, where the last light was dying behind black ridges. "It means by sunrise this place will be crawling with braves. Maybe 100, maybe more, and they ain't coming to talk." Price leaned in, his voice trembling like a church bell in the wind. "Give her up, Dawson. Ride her back out there and leave her where they can find her. It's the only way you live through this." Dawson stared at the preacher, jaw tight. "I don't leave children to die, Reverend. Not out here. Not anywhere." The 3 men traded looks. The kind men give when they're deciding if they should stand with you or start digging your grave. Finally, the deputy pulled his hat low. "Then God help you, Kincaid, because we can't." They wheeled their horses and rode hard for town, their silhouettes vanishing into the purple dark. Dawson stood there in the gathering night, smoke signals clawing at the sky, the cabin at his back, and a wounded girl inside who might just cost him his life. That's when he heard it, faint but rising, carried on the wind from the far hills. Drums. Slow, steady, and coming closer. The first beat was so faint, Dawson thought it was his own heartbeat. Then came another. And another. Slow, measured, rolling across the plains like distant thunder. He stepped off the porch, scanning the black horizon. The smoke had thinned, but the sound was growing. Drums, deep and hollow, keeping a rhythm that set his teeth on edge. It wasn't a signal. It was a promise. Inside, the girl stirred. Dawson ducked through the door, lamplight throwing shadows across the walls. She was sitting up now, eyes wide, listening. When the next drumbeat rolled through the night, she flinched like she'd been struck. She started talking fast, words sharp and tumbling, her small hands gesturing wildly, toward the window, toward the door, toward herself. Dawson couldn't make sense of it, but he understood the fear in her eyes. Fear and something else. Urgency. "What is it, kid?" he muttered, kneeling beside the bed. "What are you trying to tell me?" She held up one hand, fingers spread, then opened the other. 10. Then she clenched both fists, opened them again. 20. Again. And again. Dawson's stomach turned to lead as he counted along under his breath. 10, 20, 30, 50. By the time she stopped, his mouth had gone dry. 100. Dawson rose slowly, like a man carrying a weight too heavy for his bones. 100 Comanche braves. Maybe more. And all of them riding for this cabin. He crossed to the corner where his rifle leaned, checked the chamber, then the shotgun by the door. Enough shells for a skirmish. Not a siege. The girl whispered something behind him, voice shaking like a brittle leaf. When he turned, her dark eyes were locked on his, pleading, desperate. And for the first time since he'd found her, Dawson saw tears. Outside, the drums quickened their pace. Louder now, closer. 100 heartbeats pounding in the blackness beyond his fence. Dawson blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. "Hold on, kid," he whispered, gripping the Winchester tight. "Night ain't over yet." Midnight lay heavy on the plains when the hoofbeats came, soft at first, then swelling into a low thunder that shook the earth beneath Dawson's boots. He pressed his back to the cabin wall, every nerve screaming, Winchester cold and ready in his hands. The girl crouched by the hearth, clutching the blanket like it could keep the night from breaking in. Her breath hitched as shadows slid across the windows, silent, ghost-like shapes, moving in perfect formation. Then the sound came, a single cry in the Comanche tongue, sharp as a blade splitting the darkness. It rolled over the land, and the hoofbeats ceased all at once, leaving a silence so thick it choked the air. Dawson eased to the door and cracked it open just enough to see. They were everywhere. Horses stood like statues in the moonlight, a black sea of muscle and war paint stretching in a perfect circle around his ranch. Spears gleamed like silver fangs. Feathers stirred in the midnight wind. He counted what he could before his gut told him to stop. Too many. More than he could fight in 10 lifetimes. Then he saw him. The man at the front sat astride a coal-black stallion, broad-shouldered, hair streaked with gray, his face painted in harsh lines of red and black. Even from 50 yards, Dawson felt the weight of his gaze. White Bear. The name thundered in Dawson's head like the drums that had summoned this army. A voice rose from that iron figure, deep and cold, speaking English with the sharp edges of a blade. "White man, we know you hold what is ours." Dawson gripped the door frame, sweat slicking his palms. The voice cut through him like ice. "Send out the girl," White Bear said. "Do this, and maybe you live to see dawn." The night pressed in, heavy with the breath of 100 silent warriors. Bows creaked, spears lowered, waiting. Dawson looked back at the girl. She was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes, shaking her head so hard the beads at her neck clattered like dry bones. And in that moment, Dawson understood. This wasn't a rescue party. It was a judgment. Dawson stepped out slow, rifle low in one hand, the other raised to show he wasn't looking for a fight. The night air cut cold against his sweat, thick with the musk of horses and the sharp tang of rawhide and paint. The circle shifted as 100 warriors tracked his every move. Moonlight glinted off arrowheads drawn and ready. One wrong twitch, and this dirt would drink his blood before it had time to cool. The chief urged his stallion forward, hooves silent on the packed earth. Up close, White Bear looked carved from stone, his eyes like flint, hard, cold, and old enough to remember every broken promise made by men like Dawson. "You have my blood," White Bear said, voice deep as canyon thunder. "She walked from the wind and found your fire. That much is truth." Dawson swallowed, his throat dry as summer dust. "She was dying," he said. "I gave her water, food, that's all." The chief's gaze didn't soften. "You know who she is?" Dawson hesitated. That flicker was all it took for 100 bowstrings to whisper taut in the dark. White Bear's jaw tightened. "You knew, and yet you kept her." His hand moved to the beaded strap across his chest, fingers brushing the hilt of a knife older than Dawson's country. "Why?" Dawson's heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped Mustang. He thought about lying, thought about telling the chief he'd been riding for town at first light. But one look at those eyes told him what a lie would buy: a shallow grave and a cabin in flames. "I couldn't leave a child to die," Dawson said. "Not then. Not ever." White Bear leaned down in the saddle, his shadow falling over Dawson like a storm. "Words," he said, cold as the steel at his hip. "Words are wind." The circle rippled as warriors shifted, a sound like dry leaves stirring. Then the chief spoke again, his voice dropping to something darker. "You will prove what you are, white man, or you will die here." A signal passed through the ranks, silent, deadly. Bows drew tight. The air felt sharp enough to cut. Behind him, the girl's voice rang out, high and desperate, spilling Comanche words like water through broken clay. She pointed at Dawson, then at herself, then swept her arms wide as if trying to dam a flood with bare hands. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't changing the chief's face. White Bear raised his arm. 100 arrows followed. The chief's arm stayed poised in the air, rigid as an iron cross. Every warrior locked on Dawson like wolves on a stag. One signal, and the night would rip open with a storm of arrows. Dawson's mind raced, clawing for anything that could buy him one breath more. Then he remembered. The scrap of torn fabric he'd found snagged on his fence post, stained with her blood. He'd stuffed it in his vest pocket without thinking. Slow, easy. He raised his left hand high, fingers spread. "I got something," he called out, voice steady though his guts felt like melting lead. "Proof I ain't no thief." The chief's gaze flicked to his fingers, then back to his face. The arm stayed raised. Moving slow as sap in winter, Dawson reached into his pocket and drew out the fabric. A strip of doeskin, hand-beaded in the same pattern as the girl's necklace. He held it out in the moonlight. "Found this on my fence," he said. She'd torn herself near in two trying to crawl to water. Could have left her. Could have shot her. Like most men would. I didn't. A ripple moved through the circle. Small, but there. The chief lowered his arm halfway. Arrows didn't loose, but the air still thrummed with killing tension. White Bear urged his horse closer until Dawson could see the scars tracing his forearms, old battles etched in flesh. He took the scrap from Dawson's fingers, turning it under the moon. His face was stone, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Memory. Behind them, the girl spoke again. Soft this time, urgent as rain on dry earth. She slipped past Dawson before he could stop her, running to her father. The chief swept her up with one arm, holding her like a man grips the last breath of his soul. They spoke quick and low, her voice shaking, his rumbling like distant thunder. Then White Bear set her down and turned back to Dawson, eyes hard as forged steel. "My daughter says you fed her, gave her your fire." His jaw clenched. "But my warriors came for justice. They will not leave with wind in their hands." He lifted his arm again, but this time it wasn't a signal to kill. It was a summons. "Come forward, white man," the chief said. "If your heart speaks true, you will stand before us and answer with more than words." The circle broke like a gate opening, just wide enough for one man to walk into the wolf's jaws. Dawson tightened his grip on the Winchester, knowing full well it wouldn't save him if things went wrong. He stepped out anyway, because some choices don't leave a man room to turn back. Dawson walked into the gap like a man stepping onto thin ice, the Winchester low at his side. Around him the circle sealed shut, a living wall of muscle and steel. 100 pairs of eyes burned through the night, their silence heavier than any war cry. White Bear dismounted with the slow grace of a predator. Even on the ground, he stood taller than Dawson remembered men could stand. Broad shoulders draped in a buffalo robe, braids streaked with silver swinging against his chest. Every scar told a story. Every story ended in blood. The chief stopped an arm's length away, close enough for Dawson to see the faint shimmer of sweat on his brow, though his voice came out cold as the Brazos in winter. "You say you gave her water, Fire! Life! His gaze slid to the girl, who clung to his leg like a frightened deer. But my people know the white man's ways. Many offer kindness to hide their hunger. Dawson met that hard stare and forced the truth out through clenched teeth. I didn't want nothing. She was half dead. That's all I needed to know. A ripple of laughter came from the ring, low, bitter. One warrior stepped forward, paint slashed across his jaw like a war wound, young, full of the kind of fire that eats men alive. His eyes were knives when they found Dawson. Words, he spat in Comanche, then switched to English with a sneer. Always words from white tongues. If he is honest, let him bleed for it. The others growled approval, the sound like wolves scenting blood. Spears thudded against the ground in time with their chant. Blood for truth! Blood for truth! White Bear didn't silence them. His eyes never left Dawson's face. They doubt you, he said. Doubt kills faster than arrows. The girl broke from her father, throwing herself between Dawson and the young warrior's outstretched lance. She babbled in Comanche, her voice breaking, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks. The sight of her cut Dawson deeper than any blade could. White Bear lifted a hand, and the circle went still. Enough, he said. Then, after a long pause that stretched like a hangman's rope, you claim a heart without fear. Tonight, you will prove it. The young warrior's grin was sharp as broken glass. He spun his lance and drove its butt into the earth at Dawson's feet. Dawson looked from the weapon to the chief, his guts sinking like a stone in a well. "And if I don't?" he asked. White Bear's voice was quiet, dead quiet. "Then the earth drinks your blood before the moon sleeps." The circle widened just enough to make a killing ground. Firelight from a dozen torches threw long, writhing shadows across the dirt. Dawson felt every eye on him, cold, waiting, hungry for blood to settle the question of his honor. The young warrior stepped forward, lance in hand, chest bare but for streaks of war paint and scars that told he'd earned his place. He moved like a cougar, fluid, certain, eager for the strike. Dawson didn't move, didn't blink. He let the Winchester fall to the dust and stepped toward the center, boots grinding gravel. No man ever won respect hiding behind iron. White Bear spoke, his voice carrying over the hush like a low roll of thunder. "Blood for truth. You stand as one who claims honor. Show it." The girl screamed his name. If it was his name, she tried to say. She fought against two women who held her back, tears cutting black lines down her face. Dawson couldn't look at her. If he did, he'd break. The young warrior grinned wide, teeth flashing like a wolf's. He thrust the lance into Dawson's hands. The wood was smooth and hot from the fire, the steel tip cold as death. "This how it works?" Dawson asked, his voice flat as desert iron. "You kill me, I'm guilty. I kill you, I'm free?" The warrior's grin sharpened. "If you can." The circle erupted in low laughter, a rumble rolling like distant thunder. Dawson didn't join in. He wasn't here for sport. White Bear's eyes locked on his. Not kill, prove strength. A man who will not bleed for what he says cannot speak truth. Dawson swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. This wasn't a fight to the death, unless pride made it one. It was a dance of pain, of proving you'd rather break bone than bend your word. The warrior lunged without warning. Steel flashed, and fire tore a line across Dawson's arm before he even had the lance up. Blood welled quick and hot, dripping into the dirt. The circle roared approval. Dawson staggered, then planted his boots and gripped the lance tighter. Pain burned bright, but fear burned brighter. He wasn't about to lay down and die in the dust for doing what was right. He lowered his head, eyes locked on the warrior, and felt the old fire stir, the one he'd buried with the past. "All right," he muttered, voice low and hard as iron. "Your turn." The young warrior came in fast, low as a striking cat, lance sweeping for Dawson's legs. Dawson jumped back, boots grinding dirt, the shaft missing by an inch. The circle hissed like a nest of rattlers, voices chanting in rhythm. Blood for truth, blood for truth. Dawson tightened his grip, pain flaring from his gashed arm. Every muscle screamed, but he braced, waiting for the next charge. The warrior lunged again, spear aimed for his ribs. Dawson twisted, feeling steel kiss his side, hot blood blooming under his shirt. That should have dropped him. Instead, something old woke up in his bones. The part of him that had ridden with the cavalry fought Comanche in canyons where the sun never touched. A part he hated, but needed now. When the warrior spun for another strike, Dawson stepped in instead of back. The move surprised them both. He slammed the shaft aside and drove his shoulder into the younger man's chest, sending them both crashing into the dust. Gasps rose from the circle. No cheers this time, just shock. Dawson rolled, came up on one knee, and swung the lance wide, planting the steel tip an inch from the warrior's throat. Silence. The warrior froze, chest heaving, eyes blazing like coals. Dawson could kill him. One thrust, and the problem ended in blood. But killing him wouldn't prove honor. It'd light the prairie with war. So Dawson did the hardest thing a man like him could do. He let go. The lance clattered to the dirt. Dawson staggered back, blood dripping down his arm, his breath ragged. The warrior stared at him, fury and shame warring in his eyes. Then the girl broke free. She flew between them like a streak of fire, arms out, shouting words that cracked like whips in Comanche. Her small body trembled, but her voice was iron. She pointed at Dawson, then at her father, then at the blood soaking Dawson's sleeve. Over and over her words rose like a storm. White Bear stepped forward, raising his hand. The chant died like wind in dead timber. The chief's gaze swept from his daughter to Dawson, then down to the blood painting the dust. He nodded once, slow. "This man speaks true." A murmur rippled through the circle, half relief, half rage. The young warrior spat in the dirt, but didn't move. His pride would bleed longer than Dawson's arm. Dawson exhaled, the breath leaving him like a prayer. But White Bear wasn't finished. "You have honor," the chief said, voice like a cold river. "But honor alone cannot quiet 100 hearts hungry for justice. There must be balance." Dawson's gut turned to stone. What kind of balance? White Bear's eyes caught the firelight gleaming like a wolf in the dark. The kind paid with more than blood. The circle closed in tighter, the firelight flaring high on painted faces and polished steel. Dawson stood swaying, blood running warm down his arm, while the chief's words hung in the cold night air like a noose. "The kind paid with more than blood," White Bear repeated, his gaze cutting through Dawson like a scalpel. Dawson wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his good hand. "Say it plain." The chief stepped closer, towering in the torchlight. "My daughter lives because of you, but my people ride home with empty hands. They will call me weak, and a weak chief soon dies." Dawson's jaw clenched. "So what do you want? My land? My cattle?" The murmur that rolled through the warriors was half amusement, half contempt. White Bear's face didn't move. "Not land, not beasts. A life for a life." The words dropped like iron in Dawson's gut. "You want mine?" White Bear shook his head, slow. "If I wanted your life, the crows would be eating your eyes." "No." His voice hardened. "You will ride with us at dawn." Dawson stared, unblinking. "Ride where?" "To the council fire," White Bear said. "Stand before the elders. Tell them what you told me tonight. Show them the truth of a white man's heart. And if they don't like what they hear?" The chief's eyes glinted like wet stone. "Then you die slow, and your name dies with you." The girl let out a broken cry, clutching her father's leg, pleading in a rush of words. White Bear silenced her with a single look. Dawson felt the weight of the circle pressing in. The young warrior's sneer, the hard faces gleaming with sweat and paint. He could refuse. He could grab his Winchester, make a run for it. But where? Across a black prairie, crawling with 100 braves who could gut him before sunrise? He swallowed hard. "And if I go?" "Then maybe," White Bear said. "The sun rises without blood." The chief turned his back, mounting his stallion in one fluid motion. "Bind his arm," he ordered, and 2 warriors stepped forward with strips of rawhide. Dawson didn't fight when they tied his wound tight, didn't flinch when they took his rifle. He just stared at the fire until it blurred, his mind chewing on the truth. He wasn't riding into dawn, he was riding into judgment. They left the ranch in silence, the only sound, the steady beat of hooves and the faint rattle of weapons against rawhide. The cabin sat behind Dawson like a ghost, dark, lonely, and maybe already doomed. He didn't look back. What good would it do? The Comanche moved like shadows on the land, 100 riders slipping through the night with the grace of predators. No shouts, no laughter, no wasted breath. Just the low snort of horses and the creak of leather as they swallowed the miles. Dawson rode near the center, flanked by 2 warriors whose faces were painted black, eyes cold as moonless water. He could feel them watching him, reading every twitch, every breath. His hands stayed easy on the reins, though his pulse hammered like a telegraph key in a storm. Beside him, the girl rode a smaller pony, her frame slumped with exhaustion but her eyes sharp, darting from him to her father's towering figure at the head of the column. When their gazes met, she gave the smallest nod, a promise or a plea, Dawson couldn't tell. The sky stretched wide and star-choked above them, the moon hiding behind a bank of ragged clouds. Dawson counted the constellations like a man tallying his last coins. Somewhere out there, dawn waited. Whether he'd live to see it was another question. He thought of bolting, spurring the sorrel hard and making a break for the canyons. But then he looked at the silhouettes around him, a living tide of muscle and steel. Men who could hit a running target at full gallop without spilling a drop of blood that wasn't meant to spill. Running would only make him die tired. So he rode on, the cold biting through his torn shirt, blood sticky under the rawhide binding his arm. Every mile felt like a nail in his coffin. Ahead, the land began to rise. A long, low ridge splitting the prairie. Firelight flickered at the crest, orange tongues licking the dark. And then, Dawson heard it. The hum of voices carried on the wind, deep and solemn, like the earth itself was singing. The council fire. Dawson's gut nodded. He wasn't walking into a court. He was walking into a reckoning older than the nation he was born under. And the verdict might already be written in blood. The ridge opened into a hollow cut deep into the earth, a bowl of shadow glowing with firelight. Flames licked high from a pit at the center, sparks chasing the black sky. Around it sat the council, old men wrapped in robes of buffalo and beadwork, their faces lined like dry riverbeds, eyes burning brighter than the fire itself. The Comanche warriors fanned out along the rim, horses stamping, weapons glinting red in the flicker. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and something older, something that tasted like judgment. White Bear rode into the circle and dismounted, his shadow stretching long across the ground. He turned, his voice carrying like a drumbeat. "This man," he said, jerking a hand toward Dawson, "took my daughter when blood marked her trail. Some say he meant to trade her for gold. Some say worse." He paused, letting the words sink like stones. "But she lives. Because of him." Murmurs rolled through the hollow, low and dangerous. An elder raised his hand, his voice thin but sharp as flint. "Words come easy from white tongues. Let us hear his truth." Hands seized Dawson's arms, dragging him forward into the ring of firelight. Heat slapped his face, drawing sweat from his skin. He stood bareheaded, every shadow cutting hard across his blood-stained shirt. His heart pounded like a war drum in his ears. White Bear faced him across the flames. "Speak," he said. "Tell the council why you kept her." Dawson swallowed hard. 100 eyes burned holes in his hide. He could lie. Say he didn't know who she was. Say he meant to return her. But a lie here was death. And worse than death, it was dishonor. And if he was going to die tonight, it wouldn't be as a liar. "She was hurt," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Half dead when I found her by my fence. I gave her water, fed her, put my own blood in the dirt to prove I meant no harm." He lifted his arm, the rawhide soaked dark. "That's all there is to it." A ripple of voices broke like distant thunder. Some angry, some uncertain. One elder leaned forward, eyes narrow. "And why would a white man bleed for a Comanche child?" Dawson's jaw tightened. "Because I buried my own," he said. The words came low and heavy like stones dragged from deep water. "My boy died 5 years back. Fever took him while I was out mending fence. Couldn't save him." His voice cracked, but he pushed on. "So when I saw her," he jerked his head toward the girl, "I swore I wouldn't let another child die if I could help it. Didn't matter what color her skin was." Silence dropped like a blanket. Even the wind seemed to hush. The elders stared long into the flames, their faces carved from shadow. At last the oldest spoke, his voice thin but iron strong. "The heart speaks true, but truth does not quench fire. The young thirst for blood." The circle stirred like a pot ready to boil. Dawson's gut nodded. He'd said his piece. But was it enough? White Bear stepped closer, his face carved from storm clouds. "Then let the council decide," he said. "Mercy or war?" The fire roared high, sparks spitting into the dark like fiery omens. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a wolf howled. Silence hung over the fire like a noose. Flames crackled, throwing long shadows across the faces of the council. Finally, the eldest rose, leaning on a carved staff. "Balance must be kept," he said, voice trembling but sharp as steel. "The white man saved a life, but blood has been spilled. The young demand payment. His death will bring silence." The murmur swelled into a roar of approval. Spears pounded the ground in rhythm, a savage drumbeat of judgment. Dawson stood tall, though his legs felt like iron weights. He understood. This was the end. 2 warriors stepped forward to seize him. Dawson didn't fight. Resistance would only make it worse for the girl. He met White Bear's eyes. The chief stared back, heavy with a war Dawson couldn't see. Duty against something deeper. And then a cry split the night. High, sharp, and fierce. The girl tore free from the women's grasp and threw herself between Dawson and the warriors. A scrap of shadow against the fire, hair flying, eyes blazing like storm fire. In her small fist, a knife gleamed like a serpent's fang. She pressed it to her throat. The circle froze. Words tumbled from her lips. Fast, broken, raw with fury and fear. Dawson couldn't understand, but the meaning burned clear. If they killed him, they'd bury her too. One warrior lunged a step, but White Bear's hand rose like a wall. The firelight carved deep lines in his face, and for the first time, Dawson saw it. Fear, or pride, maybe both. The elders whispered, their voices rustling like dry leaves. The oldest raised his staff. "The spirits speak through children," he said. "The judgment is done. He lives." Relief crashed through Dawson like a wave, leaving him shaking on his feet. Around him, warriors muttered, angry as rattlers in the brush, but none dared cross the chief. White Bear strode forward, his shadow falling across Dawson like a storm. His voice was low, iron hard. "You saved her life. Tonight, she saved yours. Remember this, white man. From this day, your trail is not your own. It runs where the ground is thin as ice, and one wrong step will drown us all." He turned to his people, lifting his arm. "We ride." The circle shattered. Warriors melted into the black like smoke in wind. The girl lingered a heartbeat, her dark eyes locking on Dawson's. Gratitude flickered there, bright, fierce, and gone too soon. Then she vanished with the others, swallowed by the night. Dawson stood alone by the fire, watching the embers burn down like dying stars. Alive, but free? The night whispered back, no.